Have you ever noticed how barns seem to share the same color, no matter where you are? You can drive for miles through open countryside, past rolling fields and quiet roads, and again you'll see it. A barn painted deep red, standing against green grass or pale winter snow. It feels so familiar that it almost disappears into the background. Barns are just red, that's how they're supposed to look. But that raises an interesting question. Why red? Why not white or blue or the color of the wood itself? At some point, someone made a choice, and once you start pulling on that thread, the answer turns out to be less about style and more about survival, chemistry, and the everyday problem-solving of people who didn't have many resources to spare. To understand why barns became red, you have to step back to a time when farming looked very different than it does today. In the 18th and 19th centuries, most farmers built their own barns by hand. There were no hardware stores stocked with paints and sealants, no delivery trucks bringing in supplies. You used what was nearby, affordable, and reliable. And once a barn was built, protecting it became just as important as building it in the first place. Wood is strong, but it's vulnerable. Left exposed to rain, snow, sunlight, and humidity, it slowly breaks down. Moisture seeps in, mold and fungi begin to grow, boards warp and soften. For a farmer, a barn wasn't decorative architecture. It was where animals were sheltered, tools were stored, and crops were protected. If the barn failed, the farm suffered. So preserving the wood was essential. Paint in those days wasn't about appearance, it was about function. And since buying paint wasn't an option for most rural families, farmers made their own. One of the most common ingredients they used was linseed oil, pressed from flax seeds. Linseed oil had been used for centuries as a wood preservative. It soaked into the grain, hardened as it dried, and helped repel water. But linseed oil alone wasn't enough. To make it more effective, farmers mixed in whatever else they had available: milk proteins, lime, and most importantly, iron oxide. Iron oxide is the compound we usually call rust. It forms naturally when iron is exposed to oxygen and moisture, and it's abundant in soil and rocks across much of the world. Farmers could scrape it from old tools, collect it from the ground, or crush iron-rich stones into powder. When mixed into linseed oil, iron oxide did something remarkable. It created a coating that not only sealed the wood, but also resisted mold and fungal growth. The result was a durable, inexpensive, and practical protective layer, and it just happened to be red. At first, the color wasn't the goal. It was simply the outcome of the materials available. Iron oxide naturally ranges from orange to brown to deep red, depending on its composition. Red pigments were far easier to obtain than other colors, which often required rare minerals or complex processing. Blue, for example, depended on costly compounds. White paint relied on lead or zinc, which were harder to come by and more expensive. For farmers working with thin margins, the decision was simple. Red paint was cheap, red paint worked, and red paint lasted. Over time, as more barns were treated with these iron-based mixtures, the color became familiar. Red barns began to define the rural landscape. What started as a practical solution slowly turned into an expectation. When people thought of a barn, they pictured it red, even if they didn't know why. As the 19th century progressed and industrial manufacturing expanded, commercial paints became more widely available. Farmers could now buy ready-made products rather than mixing their own. But something interesting happened. Even when other colors became possible, red remained the most affordable option. The same iron oxide pigments that had been used for homemade paint were still cheaper than many alternatives. So the tradition continued, reinforced by economics. Red wasn't just customary, it was still the sensible choice. There were also practical advantages to the color itself. In northern regions, where winters were long and snowy, a red barn stood out sharply against white fields and gray skies. Visibility mattered. A barn wasn't just a building, it was a landmark. During snowstorms, fog, or early darkness, that deep red shape was easier to see from a distance than unpainted wood or lighter colors. Even in summer, red barns were easier to spot among green fields and tree lines. This helps travelers find farms, neighbors recognize properties, and farmers orient themselves across large stretches of land. Without realizing it, people were choosing a color that worked visually as well as structurally. There may also have been a subtle thermal benefit. Darker colors absorb more sunlight than lighter ones. A red barn could retain slightly more warmth during cold months than an unpainted or white structure. The difference wasn't dramatic, but before insulation and modern heating, even a small amount of retained warmth could help protect animals and stored crops from freezing. As decades passed, the red barn took on meaning beyond its function. It became symbolic. It represented stability, hard work, and continuity. Artists painted it, photographers framed it against open skies. Filmmakers used it as visual shorthand for rural life. A red barn suggested tradition without explanation. You didn't need to say what it stood for. People felt it immediately. That emotional connection helped lock the color into place. Once something becomes symbolic, changing it can feel wrong, even if the original reason no longer applies. Of course, not every barn was red. Some were left unpainted and weathered naturally to a silvery gray. Others were painted white, especially in the early 20th century, when white paint became more affordable and was associated with cleanliness. In some regions, local materials led to brown, green, or even black barns. But red remained the most common, especially in areas with long farming traditions. By the time modern paints and sealants made color choice almost irrelevant, the red barn was already deeply rooted in cultural memory. Painting a barn red wasn't just practical anymore. It felt correct. It connected the present to the past. Today, there's no technical reason a barn needs to be red. Modern coatings can protect wood better than any old mixture of oil and rust. Barns can be blue, gray, black, or left natural without sacrificing durability. And yet, many people still choose red. They choose it because it feels honest, because it carries history quietly, without explanation, because it reflects a time when design followed necessity, and necessity shaped beauty. When you see a red barn now, you're not just looking at a color choice. You're seeing the accumulated decisions of generations of farmers who solved problems with what they had. People who weren't trying to create an icon, but ended up doing exactly that. The red barn is a reminder that many things we take for granted began as practical solutions. Over time, those solutions became traditions, and eventually, they became symbols. So the next time you pass a red barn on a quiet road, it's worth pausing for a moment. That color isn't there by accident. It's the result of chemistry, economy, visibility, and memory layered over centuries. A simple answer to a simple problem that left a lasting mark on the landscape. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy learning about the hidden stories behind everyday things, feel free to share your thoughts or suggest a topic you'd like to explore next. And if you'd like to see more calm, thoughtful explanations like this, consider subscribing. Until next time, keep noticing the ordinary things that carry extraordinary histories.